I tell you that the world is gonna end, and you have 15 minutes to spend with me or your friends.
Welcome to Fantasy 15, a podcast meant to answer all of your fantasy football questions, or as many as I can get to in 15 minutes. I'm your host, Zach Fried, and as always, I've only got 15 minutes. We're officially on the clock. This week continues the Truth Hurts series, where I'm going to be going through each position, comparing the top fantasy finishes on the year to the truth behind how those players actually finished. For example, last week we talked about quarterbacks and how Ryan Tannehill finished as quarterback 21, but if we only look at stats from week 7 on, he was actually quarterback number 3. Today we're looking at running backs, and we're going to use half point per reception scoring to split the difference between standard and full PPR. Running back 1 on the season was Christian McCaffrey. He averaged 26.3 points per game, which is 8 points per week more than the number 2 running back on this list. That accounts for almost 120 more points on the season. He had 116 receptions, which put him as number 2 in the entire NFL, wide receivers included. He did it all with a backup quarterback, which raises the question, did they lean on him more because the offense was a little stagnant, or will he produce even better next year if Cam Newton comes back and the offense is much improved with a new head coach? Next on the list is Aaron Jones. And Jones was a value. He was drafted as running back 13, so you had the ability to play him in an RB2 slot. He averaged 18.1 points per game. But was he really trustworthy? He had multiple weeks where he struggled to hit 5 fantasy points, and he was tied for most rushing touchdowns with 16, which is great, but you should expect some regression going into next season. For example, the average running back scores on about 5% of their carries. Aaron Jones scored on 6.7%. He finished the season with 19 total touchdowns, which, to put that in perspective, is the same number that Christian McCaffrey finished with, and McCaffrey is a workhorse for his offense. On top of touchdown regression, you need to keep an eye on whether or not the Packers decide to look at a running back by committee approach. Number 3 on the list is Dalvin Cook. From week 9 on, Dalvin Cook was running back 20. He left week 15 early, didn't play week 16, and then in the playoffs against the 49ers, had a terrible game. So you couldn't expect all of this to kind of color his ADP going into next season. I think the injury-prone tag is definitely coming back, and maybe Madison will eat into some of those carries as the Vikings switch to more of a running back by committee, because Madison can carry the ball. He's a good, productive back in the NFL. At number 4 is Zeke Elliott. He was solid. He averaged 17.3 points per game and only had 2 games under 10 fantasy points. He was second in carries at 301, only 2 on the season behind Derrick Henry. But there were complaints about his usage, not so much from a carry standpoint, but from a passing game standpoint. He didn't get the receiving you'd want from a running back 1. If McCarthy is the analytics man he says he's become, Tony Pollard is probably going to eat into some of Zeke's work next season as well. Next on the list is Austin Ekeler, and Ekeler was a huge value. He was drafted as running back 29 because most people were taking him as a handcuff in case Melvin Gordon didn't come back. He averaged 16.6 points per game, but didn't have the big boom games that you were expecting. He was completely carried by his 92 receptions and 8 receiving touchdowns. The big question is, what happens with Melvin Gordon? Does he leave? And if he leaves, does Austin Ekeler come back to form that he had at the beginning of the season? Does he have a bigger role, or do they have another back step in to split the role with Ekeler? At number 6 on the list is Derrick Henry. He had an ADP of running back 18, so you had a lot of value there because he was first in yards with 1,540, tied for first with touchdowns at 16, first in attempts at 303, and first in yards per game with 102.7. He's truly the king.
Now, if you want to crowd him,
he was running back 3 from week 7 on when Tannehill took over, so you can expect big things from him next season, except for the fact that he hit over 400 carries, including his postseason attempts, and usually when a running back does that, they encounter some injuries going into the following season. The last 3 running backs to hit 400 attempts had less than 200 in the following season. Next on our list is Nick Chubb. He was 3rd in attempts, 2nd in yards, but he only had 8 touchdowns, so that's why he fell so far down in the rankings. He lost work to Kareem Hunt in the passing game, so maybe if Hunt leaves in free agency, he'll absorb that role. The offense has to improve overall, though, for him to get more opportunity. If Stefanski comes in and runs offense like he did in Minnesota, maybe Chubb will be a workhorse back, and Chubb could have a huge season. Coming in at number 8 was Mark Ingram.
If anybody else got to say something different about that, then come see me. I'm right here in Bmore outside the bank. If you got an issue with that, come see me. I'm about that. Big trust.
He was running back 22 as far as ADP was concerned, so you got a lot of value, especially if you could put him in your running back 2 slot. He was really up and down, though. The problem was, once the Ravens got up big, Gus Edwards just kind of took over, and they rested Ingram. He was only 24th in attempts per game, which is pretty low for a guy who has complete control over the backfield. He had 15 total touchdowns, so he's going to be very touchdown dependent, and there's probably going to be some regression going into next year, especially because I see the Ravens limiting Ingram's role. His injury at the end of the season really hurt them, so I expect them to try to be careful with Ingram next year. Next on the list is Leonard Fournette, and while he's finishing inside the top 10, he only had 3 touchdowns, and he only went over his projected score 3 times the entire season. He had a huge increase in his production in the passing game because he was basically the only back in Jacksonville. This was a best-case scenario for Fournette, and going forward, his role is only going to be less in the offense because they're probably going to look to split carries in the future. Rounding out the top 10, you have Chris Carson. And Carson had an ADP of running back 17, so there was a little bit of value there. He did have a big fumbling problem at the beginning of the season, which raised some questions. He finished with 7 fumbles on the season, and he had some games because of those fumbles where he finished with low fantasy totals. He was 5th in attempts, and Seattle wants to run the ball. But it looked like Penny was coming on to make the backfield more of a committee before his injury. They want to run the ball. They want to run the ball and they want to play defense, but their defense isn't really good enough yet, so they have to pass. The big questions surrounding Carson are whether or not he's going to recover from this injury, how he's going to recover from the injury with no surgery, and how long the road ahead still is. He won't lose work, probably, because every other back on the roster seems to be injured. At number 11, we have Saquon Barkley, and Saquon kind of gets a pass because he was injured and out. But when he came back, it seemed like he wasn't entirely over that injury. If you were able to somehow make the playoffs with Saquon, though, you probably did very well because his highest scoring weeks of the season came in week 15 and 16. With a young quarterback and everything David Gettleman's saying about establishing the run, you have to expect that Saquon Barkley is going to get leaned on heavily next season. I don't necessarily think he's going to out-touch Christian McCaffrey, but Saquon is definitely worth a look at drafting as the number 1 overall player. At number 12, rounding out the RB1s is Todd Gurley. And Gurley is a tale of being held back because they were worried about his knee. Early on in the season, they tried to limit his role, and once the Rams had their back up against the wall, they kind of took the handcuffs off Gurley and let him go, and that's when you saw real fantasy production. So the big question is, what exactly is the Rams offense going to look like going into next season? Are they going to try to do a running back by committee to make Gurley last a little bit longer? Or are they just going to say, we did well when we let this guy run? You also have to keep in mind, they have so many weapons with the Rams that it's not necessarily going to be the Gurley show every single game. At number 13 is Alvin Kamara. And you're probably really disappointed with this finish, but Kamara was injured, Drew Brees was out for a little bit, they played with a backup quarterback, and Mark Ingram left. So there were a lot of pieces that weren't in place for Kamara like they had been in previous seasons. He's still pieced together an all-right season, but you didn't get what you were hoping. When Ingram left, you were thinking, oh my gosh, he's going to take over the entire backfield, and that didn't happen. At number 14, we have our first rookie, Miles Sanders. And Sanders came on late once everyone for the Eagles was hurt. It was kind of a play of necessity. He was behind Jordan Howard as a goal line back, which stole some of his work. It'll be interesting to see what the Eagles do because Doug Peterson has always ran a sort of committee backfield, and so don't expect him to go away from that. But Sanders is a great running back. We'll just have to watch to see what happens in the Philadelphia backfield. Next on the list is another rookie, Josh Jacobs. And he really opened some eyes against Chicago because he just destroyed them. And he had some real up and down games. He ran into injury late in the season, and you can definitely tell looking at his numbers where he sort of wore down, which isn't uncommon for a rookie running back. Expect him to bounce back, and it will be interesting to see what the Raiders do offensively. They're moving to Las Vegas, so they're probably going to go out and try to get some weapons to have a little bit more of a flashy offense. Coming in at number 16 is Joe Mixon. And as the season went on, it's almost like Zach Taylor, the new head coach, figured out how to use Mixon. You can expect him to be a mainstay in the Bengals offense, which is only going to get better if they draft Joe Burrow. The offensive line needs some improvement. Hopefully that's something that gets addressed as well. But if it does, the Bengals offense could be incredible. We're going to go a little bit rogue now and start to jump around the list. At number 18 was Kenyon Drake. And Drake had an immediate impact in Arizona. He had a game with 4 touchdowns, which blew people away. He's a free agent this season, so it should be very interesting to see where he ends up. I expect Arizona to make a push to get him back because he fit very nicely into their offense. Drake was a player like Tannehill that proved that maybe it was the head coach in Miami that was holding all of these great offensive weapons back.
Yeah, I was good. I don't even think I asked. That was not something I was really interested in.
At number 22 on the list is Marlon Mack. And Mack had an injury and missed a few games this season, but you can expect big things from the Colts and Marlon Mack going forward. I expect them to go out and try to improve their quarterback position, which will only improve their offense. The Colts have probably the best offensive line in the NFL, so Marlon Mack, the running back behind that offensive line, is somebody that I'm glad I have on some of my teams. Finishing at running back 27 is a guy that's going to be the new hotness next year, Raheem Mostert. He's had a huge playoff run, especially against the Packers, where he scored 4 touchdowns and went for over 200 yards. Mostert was the leading rusher in the 49ers backfield, and he had 8 touchdowns on the season, so it shouldn't be shocking that he's a great back. The question, though, is what do the 49ers do with their backfield? How do they split carries? And can you really trust him going forward? I personally don't really want to play the guessing game week in, week out. But from when he seemed to take over in week 12 on, Mostert was running back 7. Coming in at running back 28 is Devin Singletary. Singletary missed 3 games because of injury, but once he came back, he was pretty solid. And you have to expect that in Buffalo, they're not going to keep Frank Gore around much longer.
Get off my lawn.
And if Gore leaves,
Did you hear me? I said get off my lawn now.
Singletary could be the workhorse back in that offense. Jumping down all the way to number 39 on the list, we have Jordan Howard. Howard only played 9 games this fantasy season, but he was a goal line back more or less for the Eagles. That's going to be something to watch next season, to see what the Eagles do. If they go back out and they re-sign Howard and they keep him around, he's going to be their short yardage, pound the ball guy, and he's going to vulture touchdowns from Miles Sanders. So it's important to watch to see what happens with Howard going forward. The last running back we're going to talk about today is running back number 42, Damian Williams. He came in a lot lower than people expected, but that's because he missed 5 games. When the Chiefs decided to lean on Williams, especially during this playoff run, they've really shown that Damian Williams can be a lead back in the NFL, and he can have huge fantasy value. Looking at what the Chiefs' backfield decides to be next season is going to be very important. I don't expect McCoy to come back, but maybe Darwin Thompson or Darrell Williams will be more of a threat to Damian's future. It's going to be very interesting to watch in the offseason, though. That's going to do it. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining me. Be sure to follow on Twitter at Fantasy15. That's Fantasy, ONEFIVE. And email any questions to fantasy15@gmail.com. And like, subscribe, rate, comment, review. Do anything you can to spread the word about this podcast. Thanks for listening. See you next week.
Thank you.